talking to the pastor, so I have a good excuse. And what we were talking about was, in July, we're going to be doing the St. James Day, and we are usually not doing adult forum throughout the summer, but I think we're going to have a special adult forum that day on the history of St. James, and who he was, and the legends surrounding him, and how he went to Spain, and the whole story, because he went to Spain, then he went back to the Holy Land, and then he was martyred in the Holy Land, but then his relics got back to Spain somehow. So we'll talk about that. Meanwhile, today we're going to talk about the Virgin Mary. Now, some of you might be thinking, why are we talking about the Virgin Mary? We're Episcopalian. We're not, Catholic. And also, I was talking to Father Chad this morning about that issue. And it seems like within the Episcopal Church and the Anglican Church, there is a broad range of attitudes toward the Virgin Mary. Everything from low church, kind of a Protestant attitude, up to there are some congregations that say the Hail Mary before services. So we'll talk a little bit about Mary. She was not just Mary, but how Mary was seen by the growing church. In the early days, as we'll discover, she was merely seen as the vessel that carried the Messiah, the person who produced the Messiah. And she was called Theotokos, which is Greek, theos, God, and tokos means to bear, or the bearer. So Theotokos means the God bearer. As time went on, by the Middle Ages, she began to be kind of seen in her own right, and began for the first time to be depicted without the baby, without holding the baby. And by the High Middle Ages, there was a huge devotion to her. And we'll talk about that. So let's launch into it. How artists' representations affect belief. These are a variety of artist representations of Mary. Some of them are icons, and some of them are paintings, sculptures, bas-reliefs. So we'll begin by kind of just mentioning that in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, in America especially, because at that point the Catholic Church had become very Irish, we see a lot of depictions of her looking very Anglo-American, looking like a young Irish lass. She was really not in any way, shape, or form. So, let's move on with her. Before Jesus' birth, before Christianity, there were pre-Christian images of the Sacred Mother and Child. These are images of Demeter and Persephone. Demeter was the Earth Mother in Greco-Roman theology. And her daughter was Persephone, who was kidnapped by Hades and Pluto and brought down to Hades. But you look at that and you think, oh, that's an early image of the Virgin and Child, and it's not. So you can see how when Christianity began to grow as a religion, people were used to this and began to kind of seek this in their lives. Also, I think there was a desire for the sacred feminine, a desire for an image of women as divine. They just didn't want to leave it all to the guys. So let's see where we're going. So in early Christianity, Mary is only important because she was the Theotokos, the God-bearer. And what I think is interesting in these early images is that they want to make it very, very clear that, wrong button. Okay, how do I get back? I don't know what to do.
You got the laptop there? Because I told you today how much I hate PowerPoint. Do you have a laptop there?
A laptop? No, I don't have the laptop up here. He has to start it back there. I'm sorry. It's one of those mornings, right? I just hit the wrong button. While they're doing that, thank you so much. This is kind of an interesting image. It shows God the Father and Jesus crowning Mary with the Holy Spirit kind of looking on benevolently. There we are. Thank you, thank you. See, we all work together on this. Okay, so what we see here is that Jesus is not being held by her. Jesus is being depicted as being in her womb. We see the circle. Over here, it's actually egg-shaped to make it more emphatic that Jesus is in her womb. Of course, he's completely dressed. He's got a toga and everything, which makes so much of the time our devotional life, if you look at it, makes no sense. But it makes sense in a symbolic way. And so for the people in the early Middle Ages, this made perfect sense. It was kind of a reminder, like, oh, who's that lady? Why is there a picture of a lady in our church? Well, because she is the Theotokos. And in case you forgot that, here's Jesus in her womb. He's giving the sign of blessing, she's not. And she's got her hands out, she's not holding him at all. So, as we move on, by the Byzantine era, we still have the Theotokos, but there's a little development. She's holding him. Even though he's still in her womb and fully dressed, there's some representation of her holding him, and it progresses to her actually holding him on her lap. So you can see how that progression would happen, and it begins to move toward a little bit of realization. She's still kind of, pictured with saints and angels. She's not pictured on her own. By the Middle Ages, now here we have an Irish image from, I think that's the Book of Kells. That's the cover of the Book of Kells, but I might be wrong there. Again, Jesus is fully dressed. By now, he doesn't even look like a child anymore. He's now like a 30-year-old in a toga sitting on her lap, but he's little. It's almost like a ventriloquist, The relationship with Jesus is strong, but you see, Mary is now taking more center stage in some of these pictures. But she is perceived as the mother, and again, never without Jesus. By the later Middle Ages, we see her depicted by herself. And she has taken on a whole new image, because she's not just now the mother, she's the sorrowful mother. She's crying. She's the Mater Dolorosa, the mother of sorrows. And I think, this is just my opinion. I haven't really read this anywhere, but I really think a lot of it had to do with the fact that life in the Middle Ages, especially for women, was very difficult. If you had 8 children, 4 of them would probably be dead before they reached their 20th birthdays. And so sorrow and misery was something that really resonated with people. And they kind of related very well to this image of a woman who lost her son. But you can see how that's a whole new development of Mary as herself, not just through the lens of Jesus, although Jesus is part of that story. We also begin to see the whole idea of Mary as protectress. She's holding out her cloak to protect the people. And this is happening because many of the towns are now declaring Mary to be their protector or their protectress. It was not unusual in the Middle Ages that the city of Siena looked to her as a protector when they were always going to war. All those city-states in Italy were constantly at war with each other. And Siena had been at war with Florence, and then Florence laid siege to them. This is in the 1300s. And before they realized they had to surrender. But before they unlocked the city gates and surrendered, they took out the statue of the Virgin from the Duomo and carried her throughout the streets as a way of thanking her for her protection, even though by this time she didn't really protect them that well. And part of that was because she was also the protectress of Florence. And so I guess Florence was praying harder. Okay, I'm just kidding, but you can see how it became very difficult. And by now we are seeing her in the blue cloak. If you look at the earlier images, she's not wearing a blue cloak. Well, there she's wearing one, but there she's not. And so where did this blue cloak come from? Interesting story for those of you who like historical factoids. Up in the late Middle Ages, they began to bring lapis lazuli from Egypt. Anybody own any jewelry with lapis lazuli in it? Yeah, it's a dark blue stone. It's not a gemstone. It's kind of, it's a hard stone, so it doesn't glitter like a diamond or an emerald or even a sapphire. But it's blue, and they discovered that if you ground it up into a very fine powder, you can mix it with oil or another medium and make paint out of it. But it was very expensive. And so then they decided that by this time the devotion to the Virgin Mary was really taken off, and they decided that she deserved, her cloak should be painted with the most expensive pigment they had. And so she began to be depicted wearing the blue robes. Now, this color, another interesting factoid, is called what? It's called ultramarine blue. If you are a painter and you go to an art store and you want some paint in this color, you will ask for ultramarine blue. I always wondered, why ultramarine? Where did that come from? Well, ultra means across or from or beyond, and marine refers to the sea. And because this came from Egypt, it came from across the sea. And so they called it was the blue from across the sea, the ultramarine blue. If you don't like history, you probably think that's really boring, so I'm sorry. If you like history, though, it's super interesting. Now we're up to the early Renaissance. By this time, the 1400s, she is very much prayed to in her own right, acknowledged in her own right. I want to say worshipped in her own right, but in fairness to the Catholics never, ever, ever said that saints should be worshipped or that Mary should be worshipped. They have affirmed the fact that worship is for God only and Christ. But if you know Catholics, or if you've ever been a Catholic, you know that most Catholics don't make that distinction. Okay, by now she's still wearing the blue, although these are old paintings, so the blue is sort of wearing off. She's also being depicted with the crown. She's this concept of Mary, the Queen of Heaven, which is also kind of interesting because by this time, okay, this is very interesting. In the Middle Ages, in the early Middle Ages, there were very few churches in Europe that were dedicated to the Virgin. Most churches were, to this saint or that saint. And then something mysterious happens exactly around 1000 AD. And all over Europe, they begin to tear down their churches and build really big Gothic churches because they discovered a way to build these really huge churches. It's an engineering marvel. If you've ever been to Europe, there are these gigantic churches, and they are built without any steel superstructure. They are simply built by piling rocks on top of each other with cement. And so for centuries, in order to build higher, you had to build thicker. And so that was why churches stayed small, because you got to the point where if you kept going and the walls kept getting thicker and thicker, you wouldn't have any place to put the pews. But then they discovered this way to use flying buttresses to support the weight, and they started building these huge Gothic churches. And all of a sudden, for some reason, all of them are being dedicated to the Virgin Mary. We don't really think about that because when we think of Florence, we think of the Duomo or Siena's Duomo, which just means dome. But all of those churches are dedicated to the Virgin. Notre Dame in Paris means Our Lady, of course. So you've got a huge devotion to Mary. As one Catholic explained it to me, well, if you want a favor from the king, you might not feel comfortable asking the king for a favor. But if you know the king's mother, you can go to her and she'll ask the king to give you that favor. Now, as a person with Protestant background, my response to that is like, yeah, but what if you know the king? You don't need to go to the mother if you know the king. But in any case, people developed a huge devotion to the Virgin Mary, and we got this image of her going to heaven and being crowned. Now, here's an interesting tradition and an interesting story. You might know, anybody in here ex-Catholic? Used to be Catholic? Okay, so you know that there's this thing called the Immaculate Conception. Some people, even Catholics, some people believe that that's referring to the birth of Jesus or the conception of Jesus. It is not. It's referring to Mary's conception as an infant of her mother, who's traditionally considered to be Saint Anne. Saint Anne and Joachim, her husband, did not have a baby in the usual way. They had a baby by it was a, quote, a chaste kiss. And that's how St. Anne got pregnant. And so Mary, and the reason that story developed was because the idea developed that Mary was sinless. And so if she was sinless, she couldn't have original sin. And because original sin was passed through the carnal act, therefore her parents couldn't have done that. And so she's sinless. Now, this goes on to, well, if she's sinless, then she's not going to die, because in Genesis, death is the curse for Adam and Eve's sin. God tells them, because you have sinned, you won't be immortal anymore. That was kind of the understanding in the Middle Ages. that humans, Adam and Eve, were immortal until they sinned. So if you're sinless, you won't die. So what happened to Mary? Now let's stop for a minute and think about how convoluted this all is. I mean, we've got Jesus, who's the Messiah, and everybody agrees with him, or agrees with the idea that he's the Messiah, and the Jewish tradition has been developing for hundreds of years about the Messiah coming, but now this is all kind of, like you start something and you never know where it's going to go. So now we've got Mary, who can't actually die because she's sinless, because she was born via the Immaculate Conception. You should know that the Catholic Church did not declare the Immaculate Conception to be a thing until the 1800s. All through the Middle Ages, people argued about it. The Franciscans tended to say, no, that's stupid. She was as sinful as everybody else. And the Dominicans were on the side of, no, she was sinless. So anyway, the story is, to get back to the idea that she couldn't die, so how did she get to heaven? Well, the story is, it's called the Dormition of Mary. Dormition means to sleep, like a dormitory is a place where people sleep. So Mary evidently went to sleep, and that was how, and she never died. She just slept, and the angels came and carried her to heaven. Lest we smugly think like, oh, those silly Catholics are at it again, we should also know that we are the Church of St. James, and the story of St. James is that he died and his relics were carried from the Holy Land to Spain in a stone boat by angels. Now, why they would use a stone boat, I mean, that, I don't know. I need to do some research on that before St. James Day. We all have our kind of crazy traditional beliefs. Usually there's something real behind all of this. Again, with the whole idea of Mary being sinless, it's looking for the sacred feminine. It's people seeking the sacred feminine, and in order for the feminine to be sacred, there has to be a removal of sin somehow. So from that point of view, I think it's kind of interesting to look at Mary as a representation of the sacred feminine. By this time, she's often seen as blonde because it was kind of, especially in Italy, people who were blonde were considered to be more perfect or more beautiful or more higher on the scale. Any questions? Okay. Well, by the late Renaissance, we're seeing a whole different thing happening here. Here she's very naturalistic. Painting had evolved to the point where people were no longer iconic. They were no longer standing rigidly. They're very natural. The way the body moves and sits and twists, it's all in there. And she's clearly very important. If you notice, going back a minute, there's always a halo in these earlier images. By the late Renaissance, she's being depicted without the halo. She doesn't need that anymore. We look at these images and we immediately know that it's the Virgin Mary. This is kind of an interesting image because she's holding Jesus, and that's the young John the Baptist sitting over there. He's already wearing the fur coat, the skins, and Jesus already has a spoiler alert. Jesus is already carrying a cross. but we see she's still wearing the blue robe, very naturalistic. The Pietà, of course, is just an amazingly beautiful piece of art, and it really conveys the suffering of a woman holding her dead son. By the late Renaissance, we have something interesting. In Botticelli's paintings, and he did a lot of paintings of the Virgin, she always looked the same. She always was this young, beautiful blonde. This was Simonetta Vespucci. And the story here is that Simonetta Vespucci showed up in Florence in, this is, I guess, in the 1400s, 1500s. She was a beautiful young woman. Everybody was just blown away by her beauty. She was the mistress of one of the Medici. And Botticelli wanted to paint her. We don't know exactly how many times he painted her before she died, if he painted her at all. She died at the age of 22 of a disease. And interestingly, for the rest of his life, Botticelli painted all of these images of Mary and images of Venus. He did the famous Venus on the half shell. We've all seen that, the birth of Venus. They all looked like Simonetta. And when he died, she was buried in I think the cathedral, but one of the churches in Florence, and she has a tomb up against the wall. He asked when he died if he could be buried at her feet, at the foot of her tomb. So we don't, historians have argued about whether they had something going on. It's quite probable that they didn't, because she was the mistress of one of the Medici, and the Medici didn't put up with that sort of stuff. They were like the mob, you could disappear. So anyway, here's several of Botticelli's images of the Virgin. Again, very natural and all looking like Simonetta Vespucci. So let's come up to the modern times, and as we get to modern times, we start seeing, modern times being any time after 1500, really, we start seeing the Virgin Mary depicted in various ethnic ways, based on where you were. So we see an Asian Virgin Mary. This is by Marc Chagall, a Jewish artist. She's depicted here still as European, but I think it's kind of an interesting image. A Mexican image of the Virgin and an African image of the Virgin, and she's kind of returned to having the baby Jesus with her, but or at least in these images. And you can tell she definitely no longer looks blonde and European and Anglo-American. People are beginning to depict her as those around them. If you're living in a certain area, you're going to depict her as the people you see on the street every day. Okay. There we go. Some other modern approaches. I think this one is Bouguereau. Interesting, it's a beautiful image. She's not really wearing the blue anymore. And she's surrounded by angels. She also has the crown of stars, which is kind of a developing iconography of the Virgin Mary. Comes from Revelation. A great sign appeared in the heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. Now, Revelation is a really crazy book, It's such a crazy book that here in the adult forum, I have never touched it. Because there are probably 800 different interpretations of it. At every point in Christian history, there was numerous people who thought that the book of Revelation was talking about how the world is ending now in the 12th century, now in the 13th century. As the year 1000 approached, going back to the Middle Ages, people were so sure the world was going to end that they just stopped. If they were building churches and stuff, they just stopped. About 5 years before, in the year 995, they just said there's no point in building these churches. The world is going to end in 5 years. In 1600, the book of Revelation can be interpreted a million different ways. Just this one verse, who is the woman? How is she clothed with the sun? What does that mean? Why is the moon under her feet? And what's the crown of 12 stars? Why 12? All of those questions have hundreds of answers. Now, interestingly, this image, anybody recognize who the artist is? Salvador Dali. Not your typical Salvador Dali. There's no melting watches, you know. In his late in his life, he became he kind of really got into mysticism and returned to his Catholic roots and became a Catholic mystic. And he actually did a number of images of Jesus, and this image of the Virgin. She's not clothed with the sun, but he uses a sunflower seed head behind her to represent the sun. I blew up the face of the Virgin, and you might be looking at that thinking, she looks kind of long in the tooth for somebody with a baby. And the reason she looks a bit older is that Salvador Dali, during his whole career, often when he depicted a woman of any kind, he always used his wife Gala as the model. And so at this point, Gala is like in her 40s, 50s, and he is still using her as the model for all his female images. Yes?
One of the things I've noticed, and not from your stuff, but us stuff, is she, the Virgin Mary, is always depicted as at least a 20-year-old, if not older. And in fact, if we study period, she was probably in her early teens at best.
Correct. For those of you at home, the question is, why is the Virgin Mary always depicted as she seems to be 20 or maybe even a little older, and yet if you look at Scripture, it seems to imply that she was a teenager, maybe 13, maybe 14 at the oldest. That's a very good question. I'm not sure. I mean, from our point of view, we can easily say, well, it's harder for us to think of a woman that young giving birth. But all through the Middle Ages, it was not unusual. It was not unusual for a woman to marry at 13. In fact, up into the mid-1900s, in some states, you could marry at 13 without parental approval. In almost all states, you could marry with parental approval. So that's a good question. I think maybe some of it has to do with the idea that the artists always wanted to give her a little gravitas, and by making her look a little older, it gave her a little more gravitas. But that's just my opinion. So we have these two. We're wrapping up. We begin to see some images in the 20th century of the real and the ideal. This one, I think, is really interesting, because if you went over to somebody's house and they had this hanging on their wall, you would not even necessarily think of it as a religious image. It just looks like, oh, is that your daughter? Or is that just an image you have on your wall of a mother and a child? Because we all love pictures of mothers and children, right? But if you look closely at it, you begin to see that there are halos, that both of them have a halo. When you see a woman with a baby and they both have halos, it's the Virgin Mary and Jesus. On the other hand, we have this very, very devotional image of Mary standing on the world, the moon beneath her feet, the stars around her head. Now you might count those stars and say, wait a minute, there's only 8 of them. Well, because some of them are behind her head. If you look at it very closely, it's a clock, 12, 1, 2, 3. So if you go all the way around, there would be 12. And of course, we have no idea why it says 12 in the book of Revelation. Everybody has an opinion. Is it 12 countries? Is it 12 leaders? Is it the 12 apostles? I do not know. This one? I don't know. It's a kind of devotional thing. Like if you go to a Catholic church, you might find that. But they wouldn't cite the artist.
It reminds me, it's not Dell, but it reminds me of what he did of God's view of Jesus looking down on the top of the cross and the world is underneath him.
That's Dali. Yeah, Dali also painted a picture of Jesus on the cross, but the view is really unusual because it's like the eye of the artist is up in the sky looking down at Jesus, and then seeing the world beneath Jesus. Anybody ever see that image? It's really good, yeah, if you get a chance, see it. So, as we're beginning to wrap up, we have, in the 20th century, we have abstract and iconic imagery. Some of these are kind of an updated modern version of the early icons we saw. Some of them are very iconic, but in a kind of abstract way. This one I love. I got to talk about this one for just a minute. Because you look at it and you go, what is that doing in there? I'm like, oh, that has nothing to do with the Virgin Mary. It's actually a bowl of milk. It's a bowl of milk being poured down this stela, or this column. Beautiful image of mother's milk, of the milk nurturing the world. And if you look at the outline of the milk, it's the outline of a woman veiled. So I just think it's an amazing image. It's the kind of image you could just look at and meditate about for a long time. The idea of the mother providing nurture and providing nourishment. I wish I could tell you who the artist was. I used to know, and it has gotten away from me. And in the 21st century, this is an image, if you go to Los Angeles and go to the Catholic Cathedral in Los Angeles, which was just built about 10 or 20 years ago, this is in there. It's kind of an interesting, iconic, yet naturalistic image. Instead of having a halo, they have a hole, and the sky is the halo, which I think is kind of a nice image. This is an image from a movie. It's either the Passion or Jesus of Nazareth. I think it's the Passion. But again, very realistic. This is an image of Mary and Mary Magdalene. And this is my favorite. It's by Tanner. It was painted in 1900. He's an African-American artist. I think it's just beautiful. If you ever get to Philadelphia and you go to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the big one, the one with all the rocky steps, the steps that Rocky ran up and down, it's there. And when you see it in person, it's breathtaking because it's huge. It's like 6 feet high and 8 feet wide. You walk into the room and your breath is taken away. What Tanner has done is this is called the Annunciation. He has depicted Mary. This is the angel Gabriel, and he does kind of depict her as a fairly young-looking woman. What I love is that if you look at it closely, she's scared. She's not saying the Magnificat. She's not talking about her soul magnifying the Lord. She's like, what do you mean? What is this going to mean? This is not going to be happy. I might need to do this because God's telling me to, but this is not the life I was thinking of. But it's a beautiful image. And he went to a lot of trouble to really depict her in the trappings of the first century. That room could have been in a first century Jewish home. In conclusion, our concepts of Mary have evolved from the very beginning, and even now it's very difficult to find an image of what she might have actually looked like. These are images of women in the Middle East now, so they are probably closer to what Mary actually looked like than any of the other images we have seen. So take a little look for a moment. That's probably similar to what she actually looked like. I used to teach at a school that was 75% African American, and I had one of my students said to me, "Mr. Fabian, why does Jesus always look white? Why does he always look so white?" And I said, well, people tend to paint what they know. So if you're an Italian painter, you're going to make him look Italian. If you're an English painter, you're going to make him look English. And she replied to me, okay, I get that. But now that we know better, why don't we make Jesus and Mary look like what they really looked like? And that has just stuck with me. Why indeed? We just don't see any images, at least not in churches, of an authentically Middle Eastern Jesus or Mary. So, thank you for coming. This is, by the way, the last of the adult forums. We're breaking for the summer because people are going on vacation and stuff like that. We will have a special adult forum toward the end of July for the Feast of St. James. Okay, so thank you. Thanks for coming.